As part of the 50th anniversary celebration of the AJSM, we're reviewing the top articles from each year of the journal's history. Today, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Bill Clancy, who is a former past president of the AJSM and in the Hall of Fame for the AJSM, and also a distinguished runner himself. And he's going to be commenting on the article entitled "Injuries to Runners," published in the American Journal of Sports Medicine in 1978. In 1978, it was the top cited article. So thanks, Dr. Clancy, for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
So one question I wanted to ask you is, did this article, the questions that this article aimed to address in 1978, do you think these questions or research questions are still relevant today?
Well, first of all, I'm very familiar with this paper because when it was published, I was the discusser of the paper, and that was published with the article. And that I've known Stan James well before he published his paper. And at that time, if we go back a little bit in history, there was no such thing as a long distance running craze until 1958, when the New York Road Runners Association established their group. And it grew slowly, and it was probably the 1960 Olympics on TV that started this real big involvement. And Eugene, Oregon, University of Oregon, was one of the hotbeds. And Stan was a former runner at the University of Iowa. And because they had so many people involved in long distance running, that Stan was seeing a lot of these injuries. And he became very involved with these injuries, particularly since he was back into long distance running. And his paper was the first of its kind, looking at why did all these distance runners start getting or having a number of orthopedic issues. And having available at that time was Bill Bauman, the head track coach at Oregon, who was one of the now gurus of running. And Stan was able to look at this pretty in depth, not just at the injuries, but at the why question: why did they get these injuries, and what could you do to prevent them? And he also included in the article ways to evaluate them. And he was the first to point out that the injuries, which we would call either overuse or overload or a combination of both, was first because it was their training technique, that they were running too high intensity with too many mileages. The second thing he noticed was that a lot of these injuries had a lot of relevance to a variation of normal anatomy, which was increasing the stresses loaded on these athletes, and pointed out the need for education to both the athletes, the coaches, and the physicians. Let's face it, at that time, and even now, presently, if you have a runner's injury, it's not going to prevent you from playing golf or tennis or skiing or basketball. And so they weren't disabling to the normal person. They were just disabling to the athlete involved. And the physicians, in general, were not attuned into why these people were crazy enough to want to do all that distance running, and they weren't really educated in talking to them. They just see a guy come in with a bag full of shoes and telling them their first injury, which occurred 40 years ago, and then the history over the next 40 years, it drove them crazy. And so it was a difficult time for athletes and physicians to get a handle on these problems. And Stan did a fantastic job of elucidating, the changes that need to be done in educating the coaches and the athletes as to the distances and the intensities loaded. And fortunately, at that time, that had just become involved, because I know this because I was at the beginning of this as a track athlete, and I was a middle distance runner, and I was a gold and bronze medal in the United States Track and Field Championships outdoors, and a bronze medal in the junior national 800 meters. So I was both a middle distance, and because I ran cross country, I was a long distance runner. and I had virtually almost all the injuries Stan talked about. At that time, in the late 70s, the New Zealand system became very apparent, and that was early in the season doing low, slow, long, over distance running. And then Bowerman put in, which is now today a fundamental, that you needed to let the body rest. So it wasn't hard intensity every day. It was hard one day, easy the other. Hard, easy was what he was trying to put out forward. That at that time, almost everybody did interval training. Interval training was hard training every day. It may vary the distance, but these produced tremendous number of injuries. Stan recognized this, and he published this to educate the coaches and the runners. And then he tried to educate the physicians by showing them how to measure, how to evaluate lower extremities to see if these were, causes or could be a potential cause of these injuries, and then suggested some of the treatment of orthotics, change of shoes, etc., to help prevent some of these injuries. And so that paper in 1978 is still, and actually is even more important today, because you have thousands of runners. You look at last week, they had 29,000 for the Boston Marathon. They'll have much greater than that for the New York Marathon. And Chicago has a marathon. Everybody has a marathon. And so you look at these athletes and say, okay, who are we dealing with? Well, you can compare them to golfers. You have the professional golfer, you have the high amateur golfer, and you have the recreational golfer, many of which play golf every day if they retire. Well, that's the same sort of disparate, spectrum you have of runners. You have the elite runners. The elite runners have the best coaches. They have the best trainers. They have the best physicians. The high amateurs, they have probably, good coaches. They have access to good, sports medicine physicians. Then you look at the average runner. Well, they're a million times more than the professional and the high amateur, and they don't know who to go to. And who do they go to? They wind up going to a primary care physician or a PA or a nurse's practitioner. And so they're not educated on these factors that Stan pointed out, in 1978. And so this article actually, as I said, should be republished in something like Sports Health, because it's still more important relevant today than it was way back then.
That's impressive. 44 years later and still relevant. There's not too many articles I can say that.
Oh, that's true.
So if you had to pick what the biggest impact this particular paper had on the field of sports medicine, you touched on some of these concepts. What would you say is the biggest impact this paper's had?
Well, I think it's education of certainly the primary care of sports medicine, which now tends to be the first one a runner sees, and hopefully, and I still think it's significantly a problem in that many times you're not going to see your primary care. You're going to see a PA or you're going to see a nurse assistant who are not trained in this area. And so it's still relevant that we need to get now to the second level of physician care or medical care for these, for the recreational runners particularly.
And you being a runner and having a very strong background in the anatomy as an orthopedic surgeon, did you actually learn anything from this article that maybe you weren't expecting or you didn't know?
No, actually, I was at the forefront with Stan, and I was actually very adamant about the variation in normal anatomy causing, being a leading cause of stress concentration and developing of these injuries. This is, I've actually at that time I had written a number of papers on these injuries and given a number of talks and publishing even in Physician Sports Medicine, exactly what Stan was saying. And not much has really changed in, as far as the relevance of all of this material, and we need to actually do a better job at it.
Well, you saying not much has changed kind of answers my my next question, but why don't we end it off with maybe your suggestions you would have for young, new sports medicine researchers to try and have sort of as impactful work as possible. Do you have any advice for them?
Well, first of all, they've done 5 years of orthopedic surgery, residency. The majority have done a year of fellowship. During that period of time, they should have been questioning in their mind, seeing the whole field of their area that they're interested in is there some way or somehow or something that I could or should be done to improve care? That you just jump out of the air and say, I'm going to do this or this, that. You need to be thinking about this. And then the question of impactful is a generalized term. Does it impact a couple of people? Does it impact the worldwide? I mean, back in, in the 70s, it was like being 10 feet from the wall and then 50, 5 feet from the wall and then 2 feet from the wall. Well, now you're about 3 inches from the wall. And so that it takes a tremendous amount of time and effort nowadays to make small gains compared to where we were, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And so that, but the gains will be there. And that people have to realize you make in most cases, you're taking somebody's step and you're adding another step to it. That happens most of the time. Something new and different is very rare, particularly in this day and age with everything that's being done. But it doesn't matter. You first of all have to have a thought in your mind that one, I want to make something happen. Okay, I don't want to just be totally away. I have ideas, I have thoughts, and that if you don't have a passion in these,